Hi there, that's right, it's Nick Dutch back on the camera again. Now, when I revisited this channel, what I was hoping to do would be to try and become a pundit for one particular argument with reference to paranormal or supernatural phenomena, and to use examples or indeed scientific studies which would point to the possibilities of some of the things that I was saying was in fact correct within certain limits. I suppose I'm still doing that, but I also want to look at claims about this type of phenomena in a relatively objective and rational light, including those claims which are essentially portrayed as being scientific, as I'm sure you've probably remembered from another one of my channels. I am relatively skeptical about other people's claims, and even when the results of the claim are published in a scientific study which uses the right statistical analysis, there can still be problems with the methodology. This particular scientific study was directed to me by a guy called Tony, and if you're watching, Tony, first thing and foremost I'd just like to say is thank you very much for putting this my way. The study itself is rather interesting. It is a measurement of the effects of proximal intercessionary prayer, namely, basically, hands-on prayer. So if you're hugging someone and praying that the Lord will heal them, that's a different thing than if you are praying at a distance and sending the healing, sending the love. Okay, so it's slightly different in methodology. But this particular study was done on 24 people, a sample size of just 24. And these are those who have visual or auditory impairments, so impairments of sight or hearing. In rural Mozambique, where you can probably expect that there isn't necessarily the access to the top quality medicine that we might have in the Western world, and therefore people are more desperate and probably more likely to invest much more in the way of faith in prayerful means. But as we don't actually know which particular cause we don't have the right quality of information as to what the cause of the visual or auditory problems were, it gets rather difficult for us to be able to say, we need much more information on that. There's a pretty lengthy discussion in this, and that's okay. But this is actually, I would say this is relatively scary. Because if you're doing a scientific experiment, you need to isolate the confounding variables. So it would make much more sense to have a sample of people who have one health problem, which is the same health problem, which is caused by precisely the same phenomena. Okay, whether it's an infection, whether it's a malnutrition thing, whatever, just one singular cause, and then to focus in on that. So that's the first issue I've got. Secondly, the sample size is pathetic. You would need to have a much larger sample size. Now, the feeling that I've got about this is that it does not quite answer the question satisfactorily. Okay? I mean, it's interesting to have a situation whereby prayer is measured, or the healing effect of something is measured. Alright? But for it to be proper science, I think more work has to be done about this. There is a mention in the study saying this study leaves unanswered the question as to what extent PIP, which is this close-up proximal prayer, by different individuals would have resulted in further improvements or diminishments of function. One particular IRIS leader was involved in administering PIP in 13 out of 25 interventions. If it is as a result of prayer, we'll have to work out whether it's the individual who's, doing the sending, and whether the individual is good enough at it, or precisely what is causing the individual to be good at this. That's another issue. So if it is a skill, you'd have to have some kind of consistency over that. We don't have that consistency over that either. So it's actually, it's an interesting study. It is self-critical to a certain degree. Okay. It is well referenced, and that's brilliant. But on the other hand, it doesn't quite answer the questions fully. It also says here, due to time constraints, hearing thresholds were measured for all subjects only at 3 kHz in each ear separately, instead of across the whole frequency spectrum. So as far as the auditory phenomena is concerned, although you could say that it's good that they're only testing on one frequency or one particular type of sound, so maybe that's okay, but it's not really analyzing in what way the hearing ability of the subject has actually sufficiently changed and improved. So that's not necessarily all that good either. Okay, well, what I'm going to say about that is, marks for effort. Great marks for effort there, because it is an actual attempt to try and measure the power of prayer. Okay. I personally don't believe it's scientific enough. I personally think that the results are interesting, but also there are questions with the measurement methodology. I would say that more studies of this type should be done, without the shadow of a doubt. But I can't say that this one particular study is, proof positive. We have a statistical correlation which is very, very positive. I know that correlation doesn't imply causation or whatever, but essentially it does demonstrate that there is a relationship there. Okay, that's what correlation is about. But precisely what that relationship is difficult to say unless we can start narrowing things down further and further and further, which they haven't done. So I'd have to turn around to you and say this is an interesting, relatively scientifically expressed anecdotes, but it certainly is not what I personally would consider to be a proper scientific study, which takes all of the little nuances into account. It would be interesting, of course, if you could just take, let's say, 1,000 laboratory mice and injure them all in precisely the same way, and then split them into 2 groups, have one with all the healing and one without, which would be quite similar to what the Russians did, but again they had a relatively small sample size. You need to have a larger sample size, and we need to find ways of making the experience itself very consistent. Sorry, the experiment itself very consistent, so that we can be sure to actually be testing it. Interesting, but no.